These are really easy to make. Grab some pine cones, borax, a drying rack, and a plastic tub. These are cinnamon scented, which obviously wasn't necessary, but they were on sale. They were also different sizes, which made it a little more difficult, but we'll worry about that later. I keep my drying rack in the oven when I'm not using it. It's not the ideal shape, but it will work. It would have been better if the drying rack was exactly the same size as the plastic tub, but we're working with what we got. The first thing we need to do is boil a pot of water. I definitely filled this up a little bit too much, as you'll see in a couple minutes when it starts to overflow. So turn the heat on high, cover it, and wait for the water to come to a boil. Once it's boiling, we can start adding the borax. For some reason, this box of borax was in these big clumps, so I had to break it apart with a wooden spoon. It should just be powder, but again, for some reason there were really big chunks in this box. Basically, you want to put as much borax as possible in the water so that the water is completely saturated. So we just keep adding borax, stirring, letting it dissolve until the water will no longer dissolve the borax. So for this particular size pot, I used half the box of borax, and then I made another pot with the other half of the box. So I used the entire box for this particular project. So just keep adding, stirring, until the water is completely saturated. I have the heat on high the entire time until the water is saturated and we're ready to pour it out. Another giant chunk of borax, and now my pot is slightly overflowing, but it's all good. Okay, this is about as much borax as the water can dissolve, plus my pot is starting to overflow. So we're going to call it, and we'll make another pot after I empty out this one. So turn off the heat, remove the pot from the heat, and we're going to want to let it cool for several minutes so that it doesn't melt the plastic tub. After the water is slightly cooled but still hot, we're going to dump the entire contents into the plastic tub. Careful not to spill or burn yourself. I did not film the second pot of boiling water and adding borax, but I basically repeated the same exact process and used the other half of the box. So here is the second pot of water going into the tub, and I needed this much water so that the pine cones would be fully submerged. So now we're ready to put the pine cones in the borax solution. So whatever you are crystallizing, you want to completely submerge in the water, and the pine cones obviously float, which is why I'm using the drying rack to keep them submerged. Because the pine cones were cinnamon scented, they started turning the water brown, which I don't think would have happened if they weren't covered in cinnamon. Again, the drying rack wasn't exactly the right size. It was a little smaller than the tub, and because the pine cones were different sizes, it wasn't sitting flat. So I had to arrange them so that they were all underneath the drying rack and not floating around. So this took me a little while to get them situated, but eventually I just gave up and it was as good as it was gonna get. The big one you can see is kind of an outlier and didn't want to stay underneath the rack, but it all worked out. So once I got them all wedged in there and they weren't floating around, you want to leave them in the solution overnight. So the more hours they are in the solution, the more crystals you're going to get. So this is a time lapse of the pine cones overnight, which I wanted to be a little bit more exciting, but it is sadly not. But you can see this is about 10 hours time lapsed. This is after about 24 hours, and you can see there's lots of crystals in the water, but I wasn't sure how many were actually on the pine cones. I could not tell. And you can see that some of the pine cones had moved and were half out of the water. Oh yeah. Yay. The crystals are really delicate, so you'll want to wear gloves when you're removing them from the water. They will be stuck to the bottom, so carefully remove them, and then we're going to place them back on the drying rack to dry. So you can see the pine cones that were fully submerged have crystals all over them, but the big pine cone on the left is half out of the water, and of course that half does not have any crystals. And the big one. Oh, pretty good. The water looks really gross, but again, it's just because of the cinnamon scent. And it actually still smells really good. So now I'm going to leave them on the drying rack for another 24 hours so that they can completely dry. The next day, I removed them from the drying rack and they were ready to be put on display. So I just put them in this nice ceramic bowl, but you can use them however you like. I'm really happy with how these came out. They really do look like ice-covered pine cones, which is exactly what I was going for. You can also crystallize all kinds of things. I also did some plastic skulls for Halloween that came out pretty cool too. Let me know if you try this, and I would love to see what you do. And of course, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. If you want to see more projects like this and other DIY home improvement things, you can follow me on all the places. I'm on Pinterest, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and my website is www.celinebuildsthings.com. And of course, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you get all the YouTube tutorials. Thanks for watching.